July 1944, the heart of Normandy, and the war is raging. The Allied invasion has broken the first line of German defenses, but the beachhead is still vulnerable. American engineers scramble to build a functional airfield to support the fighters that will protect the advancing ground forces. Time is their enemy. The Germans have been fortifying their position, convinced that no army could construct an airfield near the front lines in under a week, let alone in just 48 hours. Their confidence in their fortifications is unshaken. Their belief that the Americans couldn't possibly match their logistical capabilities firmly entrenched. But the engineers are undeterred. They work in shifts, racing against the clock as German bombers strafe the area, their presence a constant reminder of the danger. Each minute that passes is a victory. The ground shakes with the blast of explosions, but the engineers press on, determined to complete the impossible. And then, 2 days later, the first American fighters roar across the freshly laid runway, launching from an airfield that should have taken weeks to construct. The Germans can hardly believe their eyes. By June 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had broken the deadlock in Europe. After the D-Day landings on June 6th, the forces of the United States, United Kingdom, and their allies began the arduous task of securing a beachhead in northern France. Yet, despite initial success, the Allied forces were far from victorious. With German forces still entrenched in Europe, the Allies were faced with a major challenge: supply line. The Germans had fortified their positions along the coast, creating a nearly impenetrable defense. The Allies needed air support, but their airfields were located too far from the front lines to provide consistent assistance. The strategic importance of establishing a forward airfield was immediately clear. Without air superiority, the Allies would be vulnerable to German air attacks that could wipe out critical reinforcements and supplies. However, constructing a functional airfield on the front lines, amid heavy bombardment, was a daunting challenge. In the summer of 1944, the Allied forces had made significant strides in breaking German defensive lines, but they were still in the process of securing key regions and were in desperate need of air support to maintain momentum. The need for a functional airfield near the beachhead became urgent, but to build one would require time, resources, and protection, all of which seemed to be in short supply. The U.S. Army engineers, who had worked tirelessly throughout the Pacific Campaign, were tasked with what seemed an impossible mission: to build an airfield in a battle zone, under constant bombardment from German aircraft and artillery. The German military had never expected such a feat. Their doctrines were rooted in defensive superiority and fortifications. To them, building an airfield in the midst of active combat was nothing short of impossible. Their forces had been prepared for a long, drawn-out defense of the French coastline, expecting any Allied invasion to be quickly bottled up and crushed before significant resources could be brought to bear. But the Americans had other plans. The U.S. Army engineers had been innovators since the early days of the war. In places like the Pacific Islands, they had built airstrips in record time to support the relentless American advance. Now, they were applying their skills to the most critical of challenges: building an airfield in Normandy, under enemy fire and within a time frame that defied belief. The German generals, entrenched in their fortified positions, watched the Allied forces as they advanced inland from the beaches. They were confident that the American effort would fail, unable to sustain an offensive or maintain the momentum needed for success. Their lack of flexibility in thinking was a defining characteristic of the German military leadership at this stage in the war. Their overconfidence blinded them to the true nature of their enemy's resolve. The Allied forces had made up their minds. There would be no stopping them. As the Allied forces fought their way inland from the beaches of Normandy, the strategic importance of a functional airfield grew clearer with every passing hour. The Allies' ability to gain air superiority would directly affect the outcome of the battle. Bombers and fighter planes were crucial to provide cover for advancing troops, protect vital supply lines, and ensure the Germans could not retaliate with air strikes on the beaches or the rapidly advancing forces. The U.S. engineers had already established a reputation for building airstrips in inhospitable environments, from the Pacific Islands to the North African desert. These were makeshift fields that would enable bombers and fighter planes to operate quickly and with minimal resources. The strategy in Normandy was no different. The need to establish a fully operational airfield as quickly as possible was paramount, but the task was daunting. In addition to the ever-present threat of German air raids, the engineers also had to work amidst the destruction of the D-Day invasion, navigating around the cratered roads and damaged terrain. The Germans, entrenched in their fortified positions, underestimated the American ability to innovate under pressure. They had seen the Allies struggle at Monte Cassino, delay in the Italian campaign, and face setbacks throughout their efforts to break into Europe. But what they didn't anticipate was the American spirit, a relentless drive to innovate and adapt on the fly. The U.S. Army engineers, faced with the dual challenge of constant bombardment and logistical hurdles, didn't just sit back and wait for reinforcements. They set to work immediately, as if the task were no more difficult than setting up a base camp in the Pacific. The German generals, deeply entrenched in defensive warfare, had long believed that the construction of an airfield under such conditions would take weeks, maybe months. They envisioned a slow, labor-intensive effort that would be hindered by the constant threat of enemy fire and sabotage. But the U.S. engineers had learned from experience in the Pacific that speed and efficiency could offset the disadvantage of less ideal resources. Their ingenuity would make all the difference. In order to build a functioning airfield in the shortest amount of time, the engineers had to adapt the logistics of their task. Modular construction methods allowed for quick assembly, while prefabricated materials that could be easily transported made it possible to set up an operational runway in just a matter of hours. The prefabricated metal strips and airfield matting had already been tested in the Pacific theater and would be employed again in the European context. These materials could be laid over the damaged terrain, effectively creating a smooth surface suitable for aircraft to land. The design of the airfield didn't need to be permanent, but it had to be functional enough to support the incoming plane. As the engineers worked, the German Luftwaffe launched sporadic attacks against the beachhead, trying to destroy supply depots and disrupt the advancing Allied forces. But the U.S. destroyers, well aware of the need for air support, quickly began to patrol the skies and provide defensive cover. This air superiority allowed the engineers to work unhindered for the first crucial hours, buying them enough time to complete the first stages of the airfield. The Germans, watching the progress from their positions, would soon find themselves in disbelief. How could the Americans have done it so quickly? How could the Allied forces be so well prepared, despite the challenges they faced? The Allied victory on Normandy's beaches was not just a battle of brute force. It was a battle of logistical ingenuity. The Germans' understanding of warfare was rooted in strategy and firepower, but the Americans understood something more fundamental: the importance of adaptability, speed, and innovation. And in those first 48 hours, the U.S. engineers showed the world just how much they could accomplish under the most extreme of circumstances. In the midst of the brutal D-Day invasion, when the ground was still soaked with the sacrifices of the previous day's fighting, the U.S. Army engineers stepped forward to meet the impossible task of building an airfield. The human spirit in war is often defined by the determination to push through hardship, and this mission was no different. The engineers, most of them young men, had already been tested by the unforgiving conditions of the Normandy beaches. Their task now was to construct an airfield under the constant threat of German bombardment. There was no room for error. There was no time to hesitate. Every man on the team knew that success was critical, not only for the progress of the invasion, but for the survival of their comrades. The airfield they were tasked to build was not just a project. It was hope. Hope for faster reinforcements, for better air cover, and for a quicker end to the battle that had already cost so many lives. The pressure was immense, but the engineers carried on. They had seen the airstrip designs before in the Pacific Islands and knew they could recreate them in Normandy, even under fire. Every engineer on the ground understood their mission's importance. They were building the bridge to keep the Allied advance moving. There would be no second chance. The success of the battle depended on their hands. The emotional weight was felt by every soldier. Lack of sleep, the constant noise of air raids, and the ever-present threat of German shelling weighed heavily on the engineers, but it did not break their will. They worked in shifts, tearing through the hours, pushing through exhaustion, It wasn't just about completing the airfield, it was about completing it first, getting it ready for the American planes to land and turn the tide of the battle. Despite the pressures, the engineers displayed a resilience that few expected from men facing the constant reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. The "ho" moment, the first American fighter planes took off from that newly constructed airfield in 48 hours, was the culmination of that human resolve. For those engineers, the planes soaring into the sky were the proof that their sacrifices had been worth it. They had achieved the impossible. It was a victory of determination, skill, and above all, the human capacity to endure under the most extreme pressure. The construction of an airfield in 48 hours seemed, at first, to be an impossible tactical objective. The U.S. Army engineers tasked with building the airfield were up against a massive challenge. With German bombers in the air and the threat of artillery fire on the ground, every moment the engineers spent laying down runways and setting up fuel depots was fraught with danger. Yet, this seemingly impossible task would become one of the most defining moments of the Normandy campaign, marking a shift in warfare tactics. In a traditional scenario, constructing an airfield would take weeks to complete. The usual method involved building extensive infrastructure, digging runways, laying foundations, and establishing hangars, all of which required immense resources and time. The German military was deeply entrenched in the belief that the Allied forces would be crippled by logistical delays, that the beachhead would fall into chaos, unable to establish air superiority for the advancing troops. But the American military, and particularly the engineers, had learned to adapt to the unpredictable nature of modern warfare. The tactical innovation here lay in the use of prefabricated materials and the ability to use the land around them in creative ways. The engineers didn't just build a traditional airfield, they adapted their approach to meet the needs of an army that demanded speed and efficiency. Metal matting, quickly laid over the ground, could form the basis of a runway that could withstand the weight of heavy bombers. Modular construction techniques allowed for quick assembly of airfield facilities, including fuel tanks and maintenance areas. The decision to move forward with this innovative approach came from the Allied leadership, who had learned that air superiority was not just about fighter coverage, but also about flexibility and speed in deployment. The ability to bring air support to the front lines was a tactical necessity, and the American engineers delivered on this requirement. By establishing the airfield so quickly, the Americans could bring in much-needed fighter escorts to protect the advancing forces and disrupt any German air resistance. The airfield would become a critical element of Allied strategy, enabling constant air support for ground operations and preventing the Germans from regaining any meaningful control of the skies. For the German forces, this rapid construction of an airfield was not just a tactical surprise, it was a psychological blow. Their expectations of a long, drawn-out battle were dashed when the Americans demonstrated such innovation in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The German generals, confident that the Allies couldn't possibly build an airfield so quickly, were stunned when the first U.S. fighters lifted off the ground in just 2 days. The construction of an airfield in just 48 hours was a feat of military, logistics, and technological innovation that went far beyond simply laying down a runway. It was about adapting technology and existing materials to the harsh realities of war. The U.S. Army engineers who undertook the task were not just soldiers, they were innovators, using every available resource to ensure the airfield would be operational despite the constant threat of enemy fire. The result was a symbol of the Allied advantage in logistical superiority and adaptability. One of the keys to the engineers' success was the use of modular material, designed specifically for rapid construction. The Americans had already perfected this process during the Pacific Campaign, where airfields were often constructed on remote islands under similar conditions. The materials used for the Normandy airfield were prefabricated, including metal matting that could be quickly unrolled over rough terrain. This was a key factor in speeding up the process, as it eliminated the need for traditional paving and lengthy foundation work. The metal strips could be laid directly onto the surface of the field, allowing for the immediate use of the airstrip by aircraft. These strips, known as Marston mats, were designed to provide high durability while allowing for quick assembly. The mats were easy to transport and didn't require extensive excavation or ground preparation, making them ideal for fast-moving combat zones like Normandy. The use of modular airfield construction allowed the engineers to bypass the need for lengthy groundwork while still creating an airfield capable of withstanding the heavy weight of fighter, planes, and bombers. Beyond the airfield itself, the logistics behind it were equally impressive. The engineers didn't just lay the runway, they also had to establish a fueling system, maintenance areas, and communication setups. This required a comprehensive understanding of what was needed for air operations on the front lines, and how to supply those needs as quickly as possible. Supplies were carefully coordinated and rapidly distributed, with everything from fuel tanks to runway markers brought in by landing craft and trucks. Despite the chaos of combat surrounding them, the engineers' work was part of a meticulously organized operation. The combination of technology and organization allowed them to move from concept to execution at an astonishing pace. Moreover, the radar technology and anti-aircraft defense systems around the airfield ensured that it could remain operational even while under constant threat. German planes frequently attempted to sabotage the airfield's construction, but the engineers had set up perimeter defenses to protect both the workers and the developing airfield. The anti-aircraft guns that defended the engineers were part of a broader American naval and air superiority effort that ensured the Germans couldn't easily disrupt the construction. The logistical backbone of the Normandy airfield was a reflection of the Allied military doctrine: speed, efficiency, and adaptability in the face of overwhelming odds. The U.S. military demonstrated that no task was impossible when these principles were applied, and the engineers' work would serve as a model for future wartime construction across the European theater and beyond. The success of the airfield was not just about getting it built. It was about showing the German forces that the Allies had the organizational muscle and the innovative spirit to turn the tide of the war. For the German commanders watching the Allied progress, from behind their heavily fortified positions, the construction of an airfield in 48 hours represented an unimaginable challenge to their strategic thinking. The German military had long believed in the superiority of their defensive lines and the fortifications that could withstand almost anything the Allies threw at them. They had based their strategy on the assumption that the Allied forces would be unable to sustain a full-scale invasion without encountering substantial logistical problems. In their eyes, airfields were vital to the war effort, and constructing one under fire from enemy planes and artillery was unthinkable. The Germans had spent weeks fortifying their own defenses along the Normandy coastline, preparing for an expected Allied push that they believed would be delayed due to the logistical nightmare of creating a functioning airstrip. They had made the mistake of assuming that Americans would be overwhelmed by the need for proper infrastructure, not recognizing the innovation at the core of U.S. military engineering. As the engineers worked day and night to establish the airfield, the Germans launched multiple bombing raids to disrupt the construction. They believed that a few well-placed bombs could easily destroy any attempt to create a base of operation. They underestimated the speed and resourcefulness of the U.S. Army engineers, who responded by using tactical defenses and adaptive techniques to continue building the airfield, even under attack. When the first American fighter planes took off from the airfield after just 48 hours, the German generals were stunned. The idea that the Allied forces could have completed the impossible in such a short time shattered their belief in their own ability to control the battlefield. This moment marked a shift in the psychological warfare of the campaign. The Americans had once again demonstrated their ability to not only meet but exceed expectations under fire. The German leadership had thought they could stall the Allied advance with their superior air defense tactics. But the creation of the airfield proved that the Allied forces were capable of maintaining momentum no matter the challenge. The shock of seeing this rapid construction forced the Germans to rethink their position in the war. It wasn't just about fighting on the front lines. The Allied forces were proving that they could sustain operations, adapt to changing situations, and maintain logistical superiority even under the most difficult conditions. This realization sent ripples through the German command, making it clear that they were losing their strategic grip on the Western Front. The Allied ingenuity had not only won them a crucial airfield in the heart of enemy territory, but had also dealt a psychological blow to the German war effort. The race against time had reached its crucial moment. July 1944, and the Normandy invasion was entering its third week. The U.S. Army engineers had been working tirelessly to build an airfield that would enable their forces to maintain the critical air superiority necessary to support the ongoing advances. Despite constant bombardment from German Luftwaffe and artillery, the engineers' determination remained unwavering. The battle was far from over, but the speed of construction was rapidly becoming a matter of historical significance. As the German bombers approached once again, the engineers, despite the intense bombardment, pressed on. Explosions rocked the air, shaking the ground beneath them. Smoke filled the air. The distant sound of gunfire and bombs reverberated in the distance. But amidst this chaos, the engineers worked with purpose, pulling together every ounce of their training, ingenuity, and resolve. The airstrip, though still rough, was beginning to take shape. Pieces of prefabricated metal matting were laid down rapidly, covering the craters left by bomb blasts and ensuring that the airfield would be usable in a matter of hours. The ground shook beneath the engineers as the German Luftwaffe attacked, sending wave after wave of planes over the beaches. Yet the engineers, determined to meet the impossible deadline, managed to keep working. The hum of heavy machinery blended with the sound of explosions as the workers continued their efforts. Every bomb that fell felt like a threat to their progress, but the engineers refused to be deterred. On the ground, the engineers were aware of the urgency. They knew that once the airfield was operational, fighter planes could land and provide much-needed air cover for the advancing ground troops. The fighting spirit of the engineers became evident as they saw their task through, working through exhaustion, fighting fatigue, and pushing forward even when the world seemed to be falling apart around them. The German forces, watching from a distance, began to grow increasingly frustrated. Their bombers were supposed to be the ultimate weapon, capable of destroying anything in their path, including a small Allied airstrip. But they had underestimated the American engineers' ability to construct under fire. As the first completed sections of the airfield began to emerge from the chaos, the Germans couldn't fathom how the Allied forces were managing to move forward at such an alarming pace. Their expectations of a slowed-down invasion were being shattered right before their eyes. The climax of this struggle would come when, after just 48 hours, the airfield was declared operational. It was not a moment of victory by traditional standards, but it was a moment of triumph for the engineers. The first planes, initially brought in on temporary fields, finally had a permanent base from which to operate. The Allied forces now had the air superiority they had desperately needed. As the first American fighter roared down the newly constructed runway, the engineers who had worked day and night stood back and watched in quiet awe. Their creation, built amidst the most extreme conditions and under constant enemy attack, was now complete. This small, rapid victory would have far-reaching effects. The airfield would allow for immediate air support, reinforcements, and a more fluid tactical advantage in the push toward Paris and beyond. But the most significant impact was psychological. For the German generals, it was the moment when they understood the extent of the American military's resilience. They had lost the battle for the skies, and soon they would be fighting a war they no longer controlled. The Allied forces, though still vulnerable on the ground, had just secured the air dominance that would tilt the battle in their favor. The Allied engineers had turned the tide of the war, not with firepower, but with innovation, speed, and determination. As the first American fighter planes soared off the newly completed airfield, the implications of the event began to sink in. For the U.S. Army engineers, the moment was the culmination of their hard work, sacrifice, and determination. What had once seemed like an impossible task, constructing an operational airfield in 48 hours, had been accomplished. The speed and efficiency with which the engineers had worked was astonishing, and the result was immediate. The first squadron of planes took to the skies, and the Allied forces now had the air superiority they had so desperately needed to advance. But the true significance of this event was not only in its tactical advantage. The psychological blow to the German forces was profound. For months, the Wehrmacht had believed that their fortifications and air superiority would give them the edge in the conflict. they had constructed heavily fortified defenses along the Normandy coastline, confident that the Allied forces would be unable to secure airfields close to the front lines. The German generals had assumed that the logistical and construction challenges facing the Allies would delay the invasion and give them enough time to halt the Allied advance. But in just 48 hours, the U.S. engineers had turned that assumption on its head, showing the Germans that their defense was no longer as impregnable as they believed. The German commanders, watching from their positions in the Normandy countryside, were stunned. The construction of the airfield was a bold statement, not just of American resolve, but of the ability of the Allied forces to innovate and adapt at an unprecedented rate. The Germans had thought they had the upper hand, but what they had failed to account for was the resourcefulness and speed of the U.S. military. They could no longer rely on their fortified positions alone. The Americans were pushing the boundaries of what was possible in warfare, as the American fighters took to the skies, providing air support for the advancing forces on the ground. The Allied troops gained a significant tactical advantage. The U.S. engineers' rapid construction of the airfield allowed the Allied forces to maintain momentum, preventing any potential German counterattacks from gaining ground. The air superiority established in those crucial 48 hours meant that the Allied forces could continue their advance with minimal disruption. The construction of the airfield not only marked a victory in the battle for air control, but also in the battle for the psychological edge. For the German leadership, the realization was crushing. The Allied forces had proven that they could adapt faster, work harder, and innovate more effectively than the Germans could have imagined. What the Germans had viewed as an impossible feat had been accomplished by the Allies in a matter of days. This would not only impact the Normandy campaign, but it would shift the balance of power in the Western Front for the rest of the war. As the German military reeled from the blow, the U.S. forces pushed forward with renewed confidence. The 48-hour airfield had become a symbol of American ingenuity, speed, and unwavering resolve. The men who built it had defied the odds, not just by overcoming the challenges of construction, but by overcoming the enemy's expectations of what was possible. In the days and weeks that followed, the Normandy airfield would serve as a constant reminder to the German forces that the Allied resolve could not be broken, no matter the obstacles. The construction of the airfield, despite its seeming simplicity, had become one of the defining moments of the Normandy invasion. It was a turning point, not only for the tactical advantage it provided, but also for the psychological warfare it waged against the Germans. The Allies had proven, once again, that innovation, adaptability, and resilience were their greatest weapons. The success of the 48-hour airfield construction in Normandy marked a major turning point in the Allied invasion of Europe. What seemed like an impossible task had not only been completed, but had also provided an unforeseen tactical advantage for the Allied forces. For the U.S. engineers, their triumph was more than just the successful creation of an airstrip. It was a demonstration of the power of logistics, innovation, and human endurance in the face of war. But the consequences of this achievement were far-reaching, particularly for the German military, who were forced to reckon with the reality that they could no longer rely on their previous assumptions about the course of the war. As American fighter planes began to land and take off from the newly constructed airfield, the Allied forces now had the air support necessary to maintain momentum. The German forces, who had relied on air superiority to slow the Allied advance, were stunned by this rapid shift in power. Their belief that the Allied forces would be unable to sustain their offensive without the necessary air support was shattered. The psychological effect of this victory on the German high command was profound. The German generals had spent months fortifying their positions, assuming that the Allied forces would be bogged down by logistical challenges, particularly the difficulty of creating a functioning airfield on the front line. But the U.S. engineers had proven them wrong. In just 48 hours, they had created an airfield capable of supporting combat aircraft, and the Allied forces were able to continue their advance unimpeded. This realization sent shockwaves through the German military leadership. As they understood that the Allied forces had overcome one of their biggest challenges, for the U.S. Army engineers, the airfield construction represented more than just a tactical victory. It was a testament to their ability to perform under the most difficult circumstances. The engineers had worked under the threat of constant bombardment, with no guarantee that their work would even be completed before the next attack. Yet, they succeeded, and their success would reverberate throughout the rest of the war. The efficiency and speed demonstrated by the engineers in Normandy would become part of the U.S. military's blueprint for future operations. The importance of airfields in the European theater of the war cannot be overstated. With the ability to sustain aerial operations, the Allied forces were now able to provide constant air cover for the advancing ground troops, as well as to keep German bombers at bay. The newly constructed airfield in Normandy was pivotal in ensuring that the Allied advance was supported by the full might of the U.S. and British air forces. Without it, the invasion would have likely stalled. Beyond the immediate tactical and strategic implications, the airfield's rapid construction was a symbol of American ingenuity and military efficiency. It demonstrated that the Allied forces, despite being confronted with some of the harshest conditions and most formidable defenses the war had yet seen, could adapt and overcome. The engineers' work not only supported the success of the Normandy invasion, but it also proved that the U.S. military could achieve what others believed impossible. The 48-hour airfield constructed by the U.S. Army engineers in Normandy had far-reaching implications that went beyond its immediate tactical use. For the Allied forces, it proved that their innovative spirit, adaptability, and resolve were far more advanced than the Germans had anticipated. The airfield, though seemingly small in the grand scope of the Normandy invasion, marked a psychological turning point. It shattered the German belief that the Allied forces would face insurmountable logistical delays, forcing them to confront a new reality. The Allies had developed a level of operational efficiency and resilience that would ultimately tip the balance of power. For the German commanders, the speed and effectiveness of the airfield's construction were a devastating blow to their morale. They had long believed in the superiority of their defensive strategy, heavily fortified positions, long-standing supply lines, and superior air support. Yet, in this one instance, the U.S. engineers had proven that speed, ingenuity, and logistical precision could bypass even the best German defense. This realization left the German military leadership scrambling to adjust their approach. The Allied forces had not only proven their ability to take ground, but had also demonstrated that they could sustain their offensive with unparalleled efficiency. The creation of the airfield symbolized something larger than just logistics. It represented the Allied resolve to push forward despite the obstacles. The German generals watched as their assumption of Allied weakness crumbled before them. The Americans had built the airfield to ensure continued air support for the ground forces, but its true impact was felt far beyond its immediate use. The German military, once confident that their fortified coastlines and fortress Europe could hold back the Allies, now saw the vulnerability in their own defense. The Americans' resourcefulness had exposed a weakness in the German war strategy. They had become too reliant on defensive measures that assumed the Allies would falter under logistical pressure. The U.S. victory in this moment was more than tactical. It was strategic. The Allied control of the skies became a deciding factor in the war. With air superiority secured, the Allied forces were able to quickly move reinforcements, provide continuous bombing runs, and strike at German supply lines with devastating effect. The airfield's construction was a symbol of the Allied military's ability to adapt quickly and efficiently. By showing that they could build infrastructure rapidly and in the heat of battle, the Allied forces gained not only a critical airbase, but also a psychological edge that demoralized their enemy. For the U.S. Army engineers, the success of the airfield demonstrated the importance of innovation in warfare. What they had done in 48 hours was something that had been thought impossible. The speed of construction was not simply a feat of engineering. It was a reflection of the American military's approach to combat, relentless, resourceful, and determined. In the larger picture of the war, the construction of the airfield marked a decisive shift. The Allied forces were no longer simply trying to maintain a foothold in Europe. They were now on the offensive, and the construction of airfields would be replicated in subsequent battles across Europe. The success in Normandy proved that, in the face of overwhelming challenges, the Americans could turn the tide in their favor with creativity, hard work, and a commitment to overcoming adversity. The construction of an airfield in just 48 hours in the middle of the Normandy invasion is a story that goes far beyond the logistics of war. It is a testament to the American military spirit, a spirit that thrives on innovation, adaptability, and unwavering resolve in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. When faced with the impossible, the engineers tasked with building the airfield didn't just complete their mission, they redefined what was possible in modern warfare. This achievement was not just a military victory, but a symbol of the Allied forces' ability to innovate under pressure. In a war where success often hinged on speed and surprise, the ability to adapt, whether through modular airfield construction, the use of prefabricated material, or sheer human determination, became just as crucial as tanks, artillery, or aircraft. The engineers' success was a victory of resourcefulness, showing that even when faced with adversity, ingenuity could be just as powerful a weapon as brute force. For the German military, the construction of this airfield was more than a tactical setback. It shattered their assumptions about the pace of the war and the Allied capacity for logistical innovation. The Germans had long believed that the ability to hold a line and fortify positions would give them the edge. But the Americans had proven that the ability to innovate quickly and adapt on the fly was just as essential for maintaining momentum. This small victory, under the shadow of the larger conflict, was a psychological blow to the German commanders, forcing them to reckon with the fact that their strategic edge was slipping away. The 48-hour airfield represented the broader shift in warfare. It was no longer just about outgunning the enemy or holding territory. It was about maintaining logistical superiority, moving faster, and thinking smarter. For the U.S. military, this innovation became a model, not just for the European theater, but for future conflicts. The engineers in Normandy had set a precedent for what could be achieved through adaptation and speed. Ultimately, this moment in history reflects the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity to overcome obstacles, and the power of collective determination. The Allies proved that victory was not just about what you have, but what you can make happen, even in the most difficult of circumstances.